Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 1A, titled Rapid Response Collaboration, Establishing a Community for Collecting During a Crisis. This session has been sponsored by the Internet Archive. You'll see their logo here on the screen, and be sure to check out their vendor session tomorrow morning. I am Danielle Spalenka, and I'm a member of the MAC 2021 Program Committee. Before I turn it over to our session presenters, I would like to go over a few logistical details. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing in approximately 2 weeks. Please use the Zoom Q&A feature to submit your questions. It's a little bit different than the other formats. This session also has the chat feature enabled, which you are free to use to make comments or share relevant information during this session with your colleagues. But please try to direct questions to the Q&A so they are not missed. I would like to share with you in the chat feature, MAC's expectations for code of conduct. By participating in this session, you agree to engage respectfully with the presenter and other session participants. Any type of harassing or disruptive behavior is prohibited, including but not limited to abusive or derogatory comments, slurs or epithets, threats or acts of violence, intimidation, misgendering, or excessive comments not pertinent to the topic at hand. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the webinar, and if anyone engages in the harassing behavior or disruptive behavior, that person will be removed. So we really thank you for following those guidelines. Finally, you are welcome and encouraged to share your conference experiences via social media. Shortly, along with the code of conduct, I will be sharing in the chat some suggested conference hashtags. So with that, thank you very much for your time. And I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Kocken, the head of Special Collections and Archives at McIntyre Library at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I appreciate all of you being here with us this afternoon to learn a little bit about our collaboration and about our project. I want to very quickly introduce my colleagues and co-presenters for our presentation here this afternoon. They may introduce themselves a little bit more. I will introduce them in the order that they'll speak. I will speak first, followed by my colleague Jodi Kiffmeyer, the archivist at the Chippewa Valley Museum. Following Jodi will be Dr. Cheryl Jiménez-Frei, a public historian in the history department here at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And then lastly, Shane Carlson, who is a teacher here in the Eau Claire area and also a graduate student in the history program here at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. When you're ready, we can move to our slides. Over the course of our presentation, we're going to be exploring our collaboration, which came together to build the Western Wisconsin COVID-19 Archive project. We'll each be able to focus on how our different programs and our different expertises came together to be able to build what is ultimately an archive that together is much stronger than anything we could have accomplished separately. I'll tell you just very briefly about the project itself. It was launched in April of 2020. Undoubtedly, there were many archiving projects launched across the United States at that time. What we hope to do is to be able to document the lives of ordinary people throughout the Chippewa Valley and throughout Western Wisconsin. And to do that, we captured oral histories. We had users submit content directly to us, things like photographs, diaries, their own personal stories and experiences, and then also archived web pages from local news and other outlets within our region. Our project was really built through collaboration. This is the theme that will really run through our presentation together. When the pandemic unfolded in early April 2020, Dr. Jiménez-Frei and I connected on possible projects to be able to shift public history students to look at And the idea of an oral history project to be able to capture stories of what all of us were experiencing at that time was very clearly the project to shift those students to. I knew that we would not be alone in our effort to document the impact of the pandemic. And so it was perhaps serendipity that at the exact same time Cheryl and I were having those conversations, I was also contacted by Jodi, the archivist at the Chippewa Valley Museum. What quickly unfolded from there was a project that brought together our three different entities, and we each brought something different to that project, which ultimately, as I said before, allowed our project to become much more successful than had any of us attempted to do a similar scaled project all by ourselves. I'll also point out that in our early conversations, we had a lot of, oh, that's okay, but we had a lot of conversations about what our hopes and goals were for the project. And I remember looking at a series of 1918, 1919 local Board of Health records. And while those records were fascinating, they only told one side of that story. Our goal really was to be able to understand this pandemic from a lot of different angles, to be able to understand many different people in our region, including people who sometimes are silent within archives, to be able to capture all of those voices. And I'll just lastly share here before this next slide, I love the photo that we have here. Undoubtedly, many of you had the same experiences trying to come together as a team over Zoom to be able to work through really some complex projects in some very short timeframes. In order to pull this off, we use the open source software called Omeka. Some of you may already be very familiar with Omeka. We had a little bit of experience using Omeka here at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. We used Omeka Classic for a project a few years earlier. We were shifting to Omeka S before the pandemic unfolded, and we kind of quickly moved to get Omeka up and running as quickly as possible. I had to really digest the Omeka S user manual in order to be able to understand that. And a project like this, the development, sometimes it can take months, even years before launch. We had a matter of weeks in order to kind of meet our goals and to meet our community when we wanted to be connecting with them. And I'll just point out that we had a lot of additional challenges at first, as we really had to work through Zoom to be able to train each other on how to use Omeka, ask a lot of questions. I'll dive into that a little bit more in some of the slides ahead. So our project really was powered by community contributions, and this came in two different ways. Obviously, there is the community that we wanted to connect with, the users who contributed objects to us, who participated in oral histories. But there's also the community that we built between the students here on campus, the public history program, the Chippewa Valley Museum. And it's those two communities that really came together to help make our project much more successful. One of my colleagues will talk a little bit about rapid action collecting, which is really the kind of the premise behind building this particular archive and connecting with the community. One of our challenges early on was building that contribution form for users to be able to submit their stories, their objects, their photographs for us, to describe them for us, and being able to do all of that testing. But behind the scenes, our community, the students, were deeply involved in curating the content, standardizing the metadata, reviewing these submissions. So it was very much a team effort that came together to power and make this project possible. Challenges were plentiful along the way. Certainly, anytime you try to launch a project of this scale over Zoom meetings, using software that you're still somewhat unfamiliar with, being limited by our resources, there were lots of challenges. You can see some examples of those challenges here on the slides, such as objects that show up in thumbnail views, but you don't actually get to see an actual image of that object. The oral history interviews, which we ended up uploading to YouTube and then building YouTube objects into our Omeka resource because we had space limitations. And then also we had a lot of design limitations. We didn't have the technical expertise to help us code or change Omeka very much. So we had to work within the structure that we had. A lot of those problems, they lingered months into this project. We also found ourselves kind of troubleshooting on the fly as we were having to think about how Word documents were displaying and get them converted and reformatted into the PDF format to change the format so that an end user visiting our site would have an experience where they really would be able to absorb these different experiences shared by our community members. Lastly, I want to point out that there is a lot more work to be done. In some ways, I feel like we're still at the beginning of this project. Undoubtedly, there will be more oral histories conducted in the future, and certainly there are oral histories scheduled this summer that will be conducted. We were very fortunate that we had an intern working closely with us this semester who was able to kind of go back, help us to make a number of site enhancements, clean up and standardize the metadata for submitted objects, reformat files so that we were consistent in how we were presenting information to our user community. You'll also see that a Journal of the Plague Year, a larger national project, is there too. We are affiliated with that project. We look forward to being able to contribute our content into that particular project as well. So that's another aspect of the project that is work yet to be done for us. And then I'll also point out that as we look at Omeka, the tool that is powering the project right now, we don't necessarily see Omeka as the preservation tool for this project going forward. We expect to be able to take the objects submitted, the oral histories, to properly reformat them into preservation formats, and then to be able to put those into a digital asset storage system where they will be properly preserved. Because as Omeka changes and as the platforms that we use change over time, we expect this project and how this information is being presented to our community will also evolve and change. All right, Jodi. Oh, you're
Jodi,
on mute.
you're on mute.
Did it work yet? Now it's working? Okay. Yeah, I unmuted it once, but it must have technical difficulties anyway. So as Greg said, I'm Jodi Kiffmeyer. I am the archivist at the Chippewa Valley Museum in Eau Claire. We cover a regional scope of the Chippewa Valley River in Wisconsin, or Chippewa River Valley in Wisconsin. And most of our focus is on the city of Eau Claire, but we do collect from other parts of the Chippewa Valley as well. And as far as me being here at the museum, I actually started here 4 weeks before everything shut down. So I was still in the process of learning what my job would be like on site when I actually moved off site. And so that leads me into how we, the museum, became a part of this project. When I was at home and the director at the museum was kind of looking for ways that I could work from home, she sent me a photo that's similar to the one that you see here. She had been out on a walk and she saw a photo of the basketball court with a sign saying it was not open, and that, explaining why. And so she took a photo of that and sent it to me and said, we really should be starting to collect images like this, some of the smaller details that will be getting overlooked. And so being a new archivist, I contacted someone with more experience, and that would be Greg. And as he said, he and Cheryl were already talking about this project, so they invited me to join. And so Cheryl, you can go ahead. Okay, so the Chippewa Valley Museum's contribution to this project was mostly like engaging with the public and gathering submissions, trying to motivate people to submit, trying to get the word out there. The first way that happened was through the press, and this was something that all of us worked on. We all were interviewed. We all, talked to different organizations in the press, Wisconsin Public Radio. We had some TV stations, the local newspaper. Volume 1, as you see here, is a local arts and entertainment publication that comes out once a month. And so they did a feature on that. Most of the first kind of press that we got kind of landed in our laps because UW-Eau Claire had put out a press release. And so, we got on the radar of the different news places, and it was a very timely subject. So they were giving us a lot of press just, that we didn't have to look for. We've also kind of I've kept my eyes open for other ways, with the anniversary coming up, or actually just passed, we did do a couple of more interviews for the archive. And then also I've tried to contact some of the smaller newspapers in the area just to let them know what we're doing and seeing if they want to do an article, because we are covering a wider region than just Eau Claire. So just getting the word out to some of those smaller communities was important as well. And so the next thing that we did was social media, and this ended up being not as effective as I had kind of hoped. I did a series of social media posts, the COVID Archive Challenge. And what I did is I would take different artifacts that were already submitted, and I would format them for Facebook and Instagram, and then kind of have a challenge like, please submit items that are on this theme. And so these are a couple of the posts that I did. We did not have a lot of engagement with them for whatever reason. And I don't know of any contribution that specifically came from these social media posts. So I decided after a couple of months that my time would be spent better somewhere else. I will probably resurrect this part of the project again in the future, but I'm just kind of trying to figure out how we can get more engagement from that first. And then finally, programming is another way that we engage the public. I just a couple weeks ago did a program through the museum about our COVID-19 story and reflections on a pandemic year. And this kind of ended up being one of our most successful ways of reaching out to the public. I have since then been contacted by several people who have items that they want to contribute to the digital archive. Actually, several people have contacted me about contributing to our physical archives as well with COVID-19 information. But one thing that was kind of interesting, actually this morning, I just met with a lady who had contacted me after my program, and she wanted help trying to figure out how to submit what she had, and also, what of what she had would be of interest to the archive. So I actually met with her and we did a little bit of troubleshooting. And so I found through that it actually is helpful to have someone who can help the public do some of that troubleshooting with technology. And so down the road, the museum is hoping to do a program like a history harvest, where possibly we would have a gathering when things are safe again to celebrate being able to get together, and then at the same time do some history harvesting so that people can bring in their photos, they can bring in their stories, and we can help them digitize and also help them submit to the archive. So there were a few considerations that came out of my work trying to get the public involved. The first was that some people found that the technology was a little bit intimidated, and some of our terminology as well. We did test the user form. We tested with people who are not in our professions, so trying to make sure that we aren't using jargon that people won't understand. Follow through was another issue. I'm still trying to work on this one, because if I had $1 for every person that told me, oh, I have something that I need to submit, but I just keep forgetting, if I had $1 for that, the museum would not have any budget problems this year. So that was another issue. COVID fatigue. Many people were just not wanting to talk about it. That's all we're hearing, and less so as we go on. But people a lot of them didn't want to talk about it, COVID at that time. So down the road, hopefully keeping the archive open will help to alleviate that. privacy concerns. People are concerned about, you know, who's going to do what with their images and their artifacts. And so we did set up some terms and conditions that people have to agree to before they submit. And we also have made sure to stress that minors should have a parent or guardian submit for them, because they do have to agree to the terms and conditions. And finally, one of the biggest problems I heard from people was, you know, I don't think what I have to say is interesting enough. And, you know, people have been conditioned to think of archives as, you know, a place where important people keep their things. We collect about important events and important people. And, you know, we're looking at democratizing the archives more. And this is a great way to do it. One way that I would motivate people when I'm talking to them is I would say, you know, I get researchers that come in frequently that are looking for information about an ancestor, and it's very rare that I have anything that pertains directly to that ancestor. So imagine if, you know, 100 years down the road, your great-great-grandchildren are coming to visit the archive and want to find out something about you, and how excited they would be to be able to have that information. And so I just wanted to briefly talk a little bit about some of the challenges and the rewards that came out of collaboration. As I was preparing for this, I realized that a lot of our realities had both challenges and rewards. So for instance, we had varying schedules, being in 3 different entities. And so that could make it challenging to plan meetings, probably less challenging than it would have been if we were all as busy as we probably would have been without the pandemic. But you know, it can be challenging to plan meetings with 3 different entities. But at the same time, having varying schedules, we were able to pick up the slack for each other, you know, especially with working in a university. I think there are some very busy times of the year, and that kind of comes and goes. So I was able to, with a more regular schedule, I was able to do some of the behind the scenes approving of submissions when things got really busy for the other members of the team. Working remotely was a challenge. We talked a little bit about this already. It's hard to build a team when you're working remotely. I had met Greg twice before we started working on this project. I had never met Cheryl. In fact, it was a few months after we started working together that we finally met in person, and I didn't recognize her because she was wearing a mask. So that was kind of interesting. But working remotely did allow us some flexibility. We were able to plan meetings, you know, wherever we were, if we had the technology. So that was helpful. Another reality was that we had overlapping responsibilities. You know, we did try to have a function of each organization that we were going to focus on, but there were things like submitting or approving submissions that we all needed to be able to do. And so sometimes, you know, you'd get across signals thinking, okay, our interns are going to take care of approving submissions, but then find out, okay, they don't have the time for that. So then, you know, we just had to communicate really well about who was going to be doing some of that. Greg mentioned metadata standards. I think if we had to do it over again, I probably would have, you know, been better about documenting metadata standards and just being very specific, just having a document that we could give to the people who are doing the approval, just to make it easier. But overlapping responsibilities, again, made it easier for us to cover our bases. If, you know, people were busy or had other things going on, we were able to cover some of those bases that might have been overlooked otherwise. And finally, we had more rewards than challenges with this collaboration. First of all, one of the rewards is public perception. I believe that the public is watching us, and when they see us working together, they feel more like, you know, they can work with us, first of all, but also that any money that they are spending on our different organizations is being well used with the collaboration. So it helps public perception. We, of course, have wider spheres of influence that we can tap into for getting submissions and, you know, opening up the archive to different people. And we can capitalize on our strengths, and we also support each other in our weaknesses. And so I think that's about it for me. Cheryl, Dr. Jiménez-Frei is going to talk next about engaging the students and how she worked with the archives in that way.
Great, thanks so much, Jodi. And yeah, so I think that Jodi and Greg really set this up well in terms of thinking about the building the archive piece, getting others to contribute. I'm going to talk a lot about teaching with the archive. Greg and I began with the archive, as everybody, as Jodi and Greg both noted, and then Jodi came on board, and it's become this wonderful collaboration that really has incorporated our students as well. So students played such a strong role in building the archive, and that's mainly what I'm going to talk about here. It really began with this first class. This is sort of the requisite first Zoom shot, right? When we all had to sort of go on Zoom and figure out what we were doing. And this is a group of students. They were in a public history seminar. Here at UWEC, I teach public history courses. I also teach Latin American history and world history. But I had a group of students, you see them pictured here. They were doing a seminar course. And in the seminar course, students work collaboratively with the community partner to develop a specific field project. In this case, the field project was an exhibit, a physical exhibit at a local welcome center. That couldn't happen when we went online. So we thought I had to think on my feet like every other professor and teacher in the US when we went online and say, how can this be done? What can we do? And that's when I called Greg actually and said, I have this wild idea. What do you think about creating an archive? And he said, I've been thinking the same thing. So it was pretty amazing the way that the collaboration came together. We were just talking this morning about how amazing it was that we were able to do this so quickly. A huge part of that was also the students. One of the students here pictured on the slide is Shane Carlson. He's also going to be giving you his perspectives as a graduate student later. So the students, we get this off the ground. We had been talking about rapid response collections before in the class, which essentially is, a sort of a new way of thinking about collecting. Within the last 20 years or so, archivists and museum professionals and public historians recognizing when we're living through a historic moment, we need to gather ephemera, oral histories, stories that are going to tell the story of that moment, right? So my students and I had talked about the CDC museum exhibit on Ebola that was the result of a rapid response collection. Also the One Orlando collection that came after the Pulse nightclub massacre in 2016. And collections of the New York Historical Society that came from the women's marches, historic women's marches in 2017 and 2018. So this was a natural step for my students, and to their great credit, when I said, listen, we have to drop everything we've done thus far and we're going to create an archive, to their great credit, they went along with me and they did it with excitement. And so we began working on this archive. As Greg was building it behind the scenes, the students began, and Jodi was working with the community to gather artifacts. The students were gathering their own digital artifacts to document this history. But most importantly, they were doing oral history interviews. I had to give them some very quick training in oral history standards and practices to move forward and begin these oral histories, but they did such a fantastic job. And we wanted to stress getting different perspectives of the pandemic, as Greg noted earlier. So students were interviewing farmers to understand the ways that food chain supplies were interrupted. We have a large Hmong community here. We had students interviewing Hmong community members and thinking about how anti-Asian sentiment had affected them due to political rhetoric that came out with the pandemic. So we got lots of different viewpoints. We were still missing some, and I'll get to that in just a minute, how we thought about filling those other silences. But one additional piece of collaboration that's really exciting about the project is that, as Greg mentioned earlier, we are a partner institution on the Journal of the Plague Year, which is a global COVID-19 archive at this point. It started at Arizona State University, but includes partners all over the world. I put up the map here that shows the areas where different items have been donated and have come from. That includes us. We are a partner institution on Journal of the Plague Year. We are also affiliated with the COVID-19 Oral History Project, which started at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And I sit on the advisory board for the COVID-19 Oral History Project here. So the idea when we first began thinking of this, as Greg said earlier, of course, there are lots of other institutions and historians thinking about how can we document history in real time? With pulling these collaborations together with other rapid response collections, the idea was it's better for us all and for researchers and students and policymakers in the future to have broader access to these materials. So let's bring them together, right? So we share our collections with them. Rural Voices is a collection that we are going to be contributing to. Hopefully starting this summer, we'll have an intern who's going to be helping build a Rural Voices collection for the Journal of the Plague Year that incorporates our material from here in Western Wisconsin. So this was a natural project for my students in public history. It made total sense. But then I also realized when the pandemic hit, I had a group of students in my lower level classes, in a Latin American history class actually, who were really struggling still. Most of them were not history majors, and most of them still struggled with understanding primary sources and their importance to historians. So I thought, can I use the archive here? Can I assign the archive? What you're seeing are the results of an assignment that a colleague of mine in the history department developed called Documenting Your Experiences. What our idea was is we're going to assign the archive. We're going to have students create a primary source that documents their individual experiences during the pandemic, and they're going to donate it to the archive. We, of course, gave them the option, you can donate it anonymously. A lot of students chose to do that because a lot of their artifacts actually turned out to be quite emotional. Some of the ones that you see on the slide here, students expressed lots of sentiments about anxiety during the pandemic, feelings of being alone, these sorts of things for the students. This assignment turned out to be really fantastic to allow them to express their sentiments during the pandemic, but it also allowed me to better understand what my students are going through at a time when we were all forced to be distant. One example I liked on the slide here that it shows the convergence of two different of these clashings of historical moments, right? We're living through a global pandemic, but we're also living through a time of racial justice protests, right? A sort of reckoning with that. And you see that with the student who actually wrote on his mask, Black Lives Matter. He documented, what was happening during the election. So these were really powerful artifacts that in so many ways, assigning the archive allowed these students an outlet, but it also allowed them to better understand the importance of archives, the civic purpose of them, the importance of diverse perspectives. This image on the slide here is a student who is disabled, and she chose to document her experiences as a disabled person during the pandemic, and how hurtful it was for her to hear all of these messages, or some of the messages that were being put out about, just open things up. 1% of people dying is not that big of a deal. Equating masks to taking away freedom. She actually wrote in her reflection, she said, this helped me understand history making and research, because I actually realized doing this assignment that as a disabled student, I don't get many perspectives from disabled people. And why is that? Of course we exist, and of course we have lived through historic moments, but maybe no one was asking, right? So other perspectives, I had a Latino student who donated this artifact, who said a similar thing is, I don't often see perspectives from Latinos when we think about historic events. So I want to talk about how it has affected the Latino community. Some students were funny with their artifacts. They poked at they joked at the fact that, in the US, masks became a political sort of football. One student wrote, this is one artifact that I particularly loved. He wrote about how he had become a raccoon because the pandemic had forced him to sort of only come out at night and always wear a mask. And so some students had lots of fun with it. Other students really expressed a lot of emotions. In this case, this one is another artifact where a student talked about the fact that this is a convergence of two different historic moments. He said 2020 for him was about injustice, tragedy, and heartache, being a Black man in the Midwest, studying to be a police officer. And he, of course, is referring to the protests after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which is only about an hour from here. So it hit students pretty hard, particularly in the Black community. And so in his painting, he expressed, his emotions about everything that was going on. So in the end, this assigning the archive ended up being just really amazing for both me and for the students in terms of a learning experience for everyone all around. And so one thing that the student archives or the student documents had me thinking about more deeper was archival silences, right? This idea that, if no one wrote down your story, did you exist? Of course you existed, right? But if there's nothing in the records, how do we know that perspective? And Jodi and Greg have both sort of talked about this on some level, so I won't go in too deep, but essentially the archive got me thinking more about, I want to be more conscious about making sure that we are documenting perspectives of this of the pandemic that quite often are not seen. Anyone who has spent a lot of time in archives knows that marginalized voices tend to not be there, either because people aren't asking or because marginalized communities have been sort of trained to think that their perspectives aren't important, or that they don't trust institutions for obvious reasons, right? For understandable reasons. So I really wanted to think deeply about the ways that archives have the power to boost marginalized voices. And with this is the last thing that I'm going to mention is a project that came out of the archive that is continuing to this day to document the stories of undocumented workers in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is known as the dairy state for good reason. It is a $45 billion industry in the state. It is a huge driver of the economy. But the truth is that most people don't think about this. They don't realize it. When most people think of the Midwest, they think particularly white Americans. But the truth is that the dairy business in Wisconsin relies almost completely on undocumented Latino immigrants. And so a colleague of mine who teaches Spanish here, and we're both affiliates of the Latin American and Latinx Studies program, we began a project to document the stories of these workers, not only because they're integral to the economy, but they are also at higher risk of COVID-19 due to various circumstances, working in close quarters, living in close quarters, a lack of sick time, of health insurance, a fear of seeking help, language barriers, all of the following. So we began a project that spurred off the archive called Documenting the Undocumented. We have received funding from Villanova State University, from the Albert LePage Center for History and the Public Interest. It is also a project that we have partnered with other institutions, with UW-Madison, UW-Milwaukee, with the Wisconsin Latinx History Collective. So these oral histories are going in those repositories as well. So one more collaboration. And this project in itself was, it really turned out to be such a wonderful multidisciplinary collaboration that involves my students in public history, students in Spanish, in Latin American and Latinx studies, and nursing. And you might go, where did the nursing students come from? We needed to access these workers, right? Why would they trust us? Trust is a big issue with oral histories, particularly with marginalized communities. So how are we going to be able to interview them, and why would they trust us with their stories? So we partnered with the nursing program here that has a healthcare for immigrant farmers immersion program, where nursing students go out to farms, they provide vaccines, in this case, COVID-19 vaccines, or they provide healthcare in general. So my students and Spanish students, we went out to the farms and we interviewed farm workers, undocumented workers, and understood their perspectives. So this was a very important part of the archive as a whole, and the ways that our project continues to grow. We have recently rebranded it to Rural Voices, Voces del Campo, because that's a little bit more approachable to someone whose immigration status is, they don't want to disclose that. So, we had to sort of think about the ways that we approach the project if we call it Documenting the Undocumented. I need to wrap up here, but I'm happy to answer. I I was going to talk about student reflections, but in short, the students learned so much from this. This student pictured here is a student who grew up in rural Wisconsin and said, I never knew that there were so many Latinx immigrants here and that they were such a huge part of the economy. This is an image of the students at the farms. You can see the nursing students on the left working with the immigrant workers, and there was a table with the public history and Spanish students interviewing at the next table. A couple short reflections from the students on the site or on the project. One of the Spanish students told me the other day, she said, you know, people do want to tell their stories. They're only hesitant because no one has asked before. That's pretty powerful. So with that, I will leave the teaching. That's my part of the teaching piece, and I'm going to pass it over to Shane Carlson, who is going to talk about K through 12 teaching.
I'm just trying to start my video.
We can definitely hear you.
Okay, that's good. All right, hi, my name is Shane Carlson. I'm going to speak briefly to my experience as a graduate student involved with the digital archive, and then more broadly about my role as a teacher and what archives have to offer K-12 education. So just over a year ago, I was in a public history seminar with Dr. Frei, and we were reading Nina Simon's Art of Relevance and trying to figure out what to do for a local welcome center. And then the pandemic hit. And very quickly, thanks to Dr. Frei and Greg, they turned a moment of adversity into one of opportunity, because as in the first year of the grad program, myself and my classmates didn't have a lot of experience with oral history or with archives in general. So we got to learn how to conduct oral histories, how to create, collect and interpret artifacts, ways to consider that, like how would these artifacts be usable in museums in the future? But we also had to consider silences and how we were going to meet the needs of our community. And the graduate students turned we got together and helped each other survive the semester. We had weekly Zoom calls where we just talked about what was difficult. We had other classes together that we had to share resources and ideas and write historiography papers. So we had a lot to work on, and we ended up commiserating quite a bit. But we also got to connect more with our communities. And in one of the oral histories that I conducted, it was with a local journalist that was interviewing me for the project. And so in turn, I asked her if she wouldn't mind submitting an oral history. And she had brought up that in many of the interviews she was conducting, people were expressing how they felt more connected to their community than they thought they would be, or that they had been before, just through the ways that the pandemic had brought us together and created like experiences that you talk about, such as what your mask is, like if you have an N95 mask, or in my case, my grandma made my mask because she sews all the time. And just moments like that where you end up, talking to someone walking down the sidewalk and waving, or saying, I like the paper cutout hearts that you put on your window. All right. The remainder of my time, I'm going to speak more about using archives as a teaching tool, and more specifically, how archival materials can be utilized to promote learning experiences. And this first example comes from Sherman Elementary School. Students at Sherman Elementary, that's here in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, students at Sherman Elementary were asked to create artifacts that could contribute to the digital archive through journaling. And so they would journal about like how adults are talking about the pandemic, how is life different during the pandemic. And this was paired with a book series called I Survived. And in the I Survived series, it talks about it takes there are different stories about young people going through difficult and traumatic situations. So it made for a good pairing with their journals, and students could draw similarities and differences. But it also turned out to be a good literacy builder for students because they had to develop comprehension of new terminology, just in expressing the ways that COVID changes our lives and the different terminology that we have to come up with to explain it, such as social distancing. They had to apply what they learned to lived and imagined experiences. And they had to use this information across physical and digital mediums, which is pretty important because I don't like getting emails with more acronyms than words. But most importantly, this helped meet students' emotional needs, where teachers could see that students were empathizing with their peers and helping each other get through it. But they could also see where a student might just need a little extra time, and that happened for me a bit too. I had to set up a separate conference call with a student just to talk about how life is going and what the light at the end of the tunnel is and how to get through this. As at the high school level, archives offer new ways to interpret the past. A good example that is pretty relevant right now is Nancy Bristow's American Pandemic, where she analyzed archives to understand the ways that gender, poverty, and race contributed to how people expressed experiences during the pandemic. And she looked at the correspondence, local newspapers, and reports from local commissions to do that. In my classroom, just this last semester, I taught a U.S. history class, and I used the WPA archives called Born in Slavery from their oral history collection. And I used that to help students understand how memory changes over times and how identity can be studied through archives. And it really helped students ask the question, well, whose history is this? And we could also talk about the limitations of oral histories. For any educators thinking about incorporating oral history projects, I recommend there's a useful website called Documenting in Times of Crisis. It's actually a project that was created in 2018 to help with communities that are seeking to conduct an oral history project. And it gives manuals and resources for collection, management, and oral histories. It's very adaptable into the education setting. And let's go, could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. And lastly, this is most important because it helps us treat students as historical actors. Students have enough going on in their lives that they're not walking around thinking about how this is history or how it will be history. And working with archives, it helps you see that the material we interact with in everyday life, they will be artifacts. So whether they're contributing to Journal of the Plague Year, or in my class next year, I'm planning on using a project through the University of California called the Living New Deal. There's a digital archive that doesn't have a lot of material from Wisconsin. And I know just in Eau Claire, we have a handful of CCC projects that they could contribute to this archive. And aside from contributing to archives, it's important that students see the usefulness of this material in everyday life experiences. And this can be done through how they interact with their local history. So collaborating with historical societies, museums, heritage centers, etc. I grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I remember walking around downtown, just looking at the old buildings, and you see the years and the dates at the top of the building, and you just wonder, like, oh, 1902. I wonder what it was like way back then, seeing or like having a horse and buggy come down the street. How did they handle the first automobiles? And just taking you back in time, where students in La Crosse today can do that. They have an oral history project called Here Here that uses oral histories, and there's an app you download, and you can walk to those places, and students can listen to people talk about the past. So the benefits of treating students as historical actors are going to continue to serve the community and historical awareness for years. It promotes public history in the community. It helps students contextualize the past better. It helps students get more engaged with their local history and also engage their families in local history. And it makes for a more meaningful and relevant experience. And hopefully at the end that they can see public history and the use of archives and our material existence is a collaborative effort. And we all have a say in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. We did have a few questions come in during the course of the presentation, 3 of them, and I'm going to read those questions back, and I'll probably field the first one and then point to my colleagues to be able to address some of the other questions that came in. And as you have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A and we'll try to get to them. So the first question came in, and it was, in terms of archiving materials, how was it decided which participating institution received the collections? Jodi and I had a conversation about this very early in the process. At this time, UW-Eau Claire is a little bit further along in establishing a digital asset preservation environment. And so the UW-Eau Claire Archives agreed to be the repository on record for the materials that we are collecting. Although it's worth noting 2 things. First, many elements of our project are being shared with other projects around the nation. And in some ways, those copies will also be preserved through those other projects. And then I'll also add that I think in part through our collaboration, we've seen the repository at UW-Eau Claire and that at the Chippewa Valley Museum kind of grow closer together. And I really see our work in this and probably future projects as being more complementary. And so we really operate as one larger community archive with 2 locations as opposed to separate archival repositories. Of course, we have different missions and goals, et cetera, but I just wanted to kind of answer that and point that out. The next question that we have, let me just make sure I get this. Did you try and document the healthcare worker experience? Did you reach out to the local healthcare providers to see if they wanted to participate in your project? And maybe Dr. Jiménez-Frei could respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, that was absolutely a part of the oral histories that we gathered. So a lot of students, so the oral history assignment for public history students in my courses started last spring, of course, when the pandemic hit. It has continued every semester as I teach an intro public history course. I taught in the fall. I'm also teaching it this semester. So students have continued to build on the oral histories. I'm really glad that somebody asked this question because I don't think I mentioned this, that one of the fantastic things about our collection is it has continued to grow. So we can look at oral histories from last spring and compare those to oral histories that students are doing now. Obviously, the perspectives of the pandemic are very different, right? 1 year and some months in. But healthcare workers have absolutely been a part of our oral histories. And I know that there is another collaboration with UWEC and the Mayo Clinic, where there's going to be more oral histories with healthcare workers, and it'll be a particular collection with the Mayo Clinic. So good question.
Thank you. Next one came in through chat. Could you describe for us the transcription process for the Rural Voices project? Did they do transcriptions in both Spanish and English? Were there subtitles added to the interviews? I know we had a lot of conversations on this, so I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, Emily, really good question. So, okay, so one thing that I didn't, because I was kind of cramming a lot in my part of the presentation, is that I wanted to also say that with rapid response collections, this is something that Greg touched on too. You got to kind of figure stuff out as you go, right? That's the very nature of a project like this. You have to be flexible, and to the great credit of my students, they've been flexible. Greg and Jodi, everybody, we're just trying to we don't realize issues until they come up, right? And one issue was this, right? We have this fantastic idea. We're going to do interviews in Spanish, but then we realized, oh, okay, most transcription softwares like Otter AI, Zoom's transcriptions, they just don't recognize Spanish, which is such a huge oversight, right? Like a void, right? So my Spanish interns and we really had to kind of troubleshoot this, right? Can we find a transcription software that actually recognizes Spanish to some level that it's still sort of good enough for them to work with and then clean up on the back end. They're also working to transcribe them in English. So yes, the answer to that is yes, we're doing transcriptions. It is in the process now. My interns have the majority of the interviews that they conducted in the spring, which most of them came from COVID-19 vaccine clinics. Those are transcribed in Spanish. Over the summer, we have another intern who is actually coming to us from the Albert LePage Center for History in the Public Interest at Villanova. That Villanova offered us an intern who is a native Spanish speaker to work on this project with us, which is really great. And so that's yet another collaborative piece of this. So that intern is going to be working with Greg and I and my colleagues on the Undocumented Workers Project. And she's going to be translating the original Spanish transcripts into English. Were there subtitles added, that last piece? So we had imagined, this is another thing with the Rapid Response Project, with the way we were doing oral histories with everyone else was on Zoom, because Zoom is a part of our lives now, right? And it's another timestamp of the pandemic. It makes the artifact even more so a part of our moment. But the truth is that undocumented farm workers, the vast majority of them wanted to be anonymous for obvious reasons, right? For fears of their immigration status. Most of them chose to be anonymous, and most of them chose to have to do audio only, right? That Zoom was a whole other technical thing, right? They're more likely to give an interview on the site. So in terms of putting the subtitles on, we haven't quite figured that out yet, is that when we are able to put those up, how are we going to add the transcriptions? It's not like there's a video that they are scrolled across. It may just be an audio piece on the archive with the transcript translated in English. Again, part of Rapid Response Collections projects is part of the fun of it, right? Is trying to figure out how we meet each little challenge as it comes along.
And then I see Shane responded to a question about the Living New Deal project by the Department of Geography out of UC Berkeley. So you can see that link is responded to in the Q&A there as well. It does look like we're pretty close to out of time, but certainly on behalf of my colleagues and collaborators on this great project, I want to thank all of you for joining us and listening to us today, learning a little bit about our collaboration. I'll turn it over to Mac if there's anything that Mac needs to say. Otherwise, thank you. All right, well, thank you, everyone. It was wonderful to be able to share this with you today.
Yeah, thanks for all the collaborative work. I mean, it's been a really fun project, and it's something I think that the last thing I want to say is that I think Greg mentioned this too, is that in so many ways we're kind of still in the beginning of this, right? Is that it's a project that's going to continue. And at this point, we have collected a lot. There's a lot of analysis to be done, right? What we haven't even been able to have students cull through what we found and come up with some conclusions, right? So there's a whole other piece of this project to come.
Thank you for a wonderful session. And thanks everyone for attending. Hope to see you at more sessions.